In 1924, immigration hit a serious turning point to enforce rules for those entering the U.S. This was due to the mass number of immigrants entering the United States. The United States was made mostly by immigrants and is known for that, since many were and still are hoping to get into a promise made by many of a country so special. Numbers overflowed. Unfortunately, many of the immigrants wanting to migrate didn't always have the credentials asked for within the many U.S. inspection regulations. Since immigration ran big, inspection islands and buildings were made to ensure that everyone entering was safe. In 1907, 1.3 million people were entering the U.S. through Ellis Island alone. Like many ideas and concepts, immigration rules have gone back and forth between what is really needed and what is not in order to manifest. Immigration rules and regulations are always changing due to population and immigration amounts going back and forth. President Wilson stated, "If the people of the country have made up their minds to limit the number of immigrants by arbitrary cut and so reverse the policy of all generations of Americans that have gone before them, then it is their right to do so. But I do not believe that they have." Immigration acts and quotas have been constantly changing for as long as they have been around. Starting in 1882, the U.S. passed the Chinese Exclusion Act due to millions entering the U.S. A few years later, in 1891, expectations were set for other countries as well. Then in 1892, Ellis Island was made, which ended up being one of the biggest inspection buildings to exist. At this time, much of the inspections had to do with health and literacy, though immigration had some wiggle room for certain people, such as immigrants who were either very intelligent or talented in one way or another, as well as slaves who got into America fairly easily, but with unfair conditions when they worked. In 1910, approximately 3/4 of New York's population was first-generation Americans and immigrants. Since the United States was overflowing with people trying to find and keep jobs, it became much harder to live day-to-day life, so limitations needed to be set. Due to immigration in the States, there became a fear of newcomers among many Americans known as xenophobia. In 1921, another act was passed as a plan highly regarded as an experiment that was temporary to give America a breathing spell, which happened to be the birth of cartoons showing the popular anti-immigrant idea. May 19, 1921, President Warren G. signed the Johnson Act, an emergency quota of 1921. 3 years later, on May 26, 1924, President Coolidge signed a new immigration act that would allow visas to 2% of the total amount of people of each nationality in the U.S. at the 1890 census. This was introduced by Congressman Albert Johnson in order to restrict even more the idea of keeping the undesirable away. This act completely excluded immigrants from Asia, the Philippines, and the American colony. In 1924, the U.S. Border Control was established in order to crack down on the border. This, just like many pieces of legislation, affected many in positive and negative ways. Looking into right after this piece of legislation was official in 1924, the act was in part in favor of the agricultural needs, so they kept the ideas and institutions of immigration like Simmons' Amendment into provision, which gave preferential consideration to bona fide farmers along with a close relative of American citizens for up to 50% of each nation's quota. After President Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act of 1924, many people weren't happy and disagreed with the act, such as in 1928, the Young Men's Christian Association church congregations and the League of Women Voters protested Congress for the families who were unable to join men who had migrated before 1924. In 1925, a group of 200,000 Portuguese wrote a letter to James J. Davis, who was a part of the Department of Labor, saying that they should be allowed to bring more immigrants to the U.S. due to the changes they made on agriculture in California and how it benefited the U.S. In 1928, an article in the Ohio Jewish Chronicle explained in their own words what the new regulation did. This was seen by many civilians and affected their opinion. Within the same year, the issue of immigration remained in the presidential campaign, changing the flow of votes. Since the U.S. needed a break from so much immigration, the Act in 1924 helped slow their roll, and during the time they found positive regulations that the government continued to use in the late 1900s, and some of the ideas like visas are still used to smooth immigration now. Immigration numbers went down after 1924 and can be seen in studies showing the immigrant population starting July 1st, 1910, there was a percent increase of 21. From July 1st, 1920, the population increased only by 14.9%. Constantly, laws are changing to advance with day-to-day lives. We haven't quite found out the right plan to make everything perfect yet, especially immigration restrictions. Since America was and is known for new opportunities, Population count and immigration count were always fairly high. Leading into the 1900s, immigration counts were off the charts, so to ensure that the U.S. is manifesting, it required strict laws. In 1924, President Coolidge signed a new piece of legislation that broke immigration regulation barriers due to how strict they became and the restrictions plus the reactions to them, which ended up being such a helpful realization for the government to know what works for immigration to run smoothly. Credits to all the wonderful sources I use in order to really understand and explain the Immigration Act of 1924 and immigration in general, including the JSTOR Library, where I found many wonderful books. Thanks as well to all of the writers who wrote them, plus the pictures I found from different articles that really helped make this visually appealing.